Good morning, everybody. Welcome to LargsNaz. We had an excellent lunch and learn yesterday. The topic was plants that heal, so we talked about plants that, flower power. We had a great group. We talked about plants you can find out in the wild and what they can do to help us lead healthier lives. And we had lots of great food and great fellowship.
And that's why we had such a spread this morning, because we had lots of leftovers.
Yes, we had lots of leftovers. So yay for lunch and learns. It was a really, really great day yesterday. What announcements? Do you have some announcements?
Well, we just want to welcome our online audience. We thank you for joining us again. And this, as you may know, is our last Salt Beach Sunday of this year. Summer's over. We're moving into fall pretty soon, but it'll be back again next year. I have a feeling that this is a tradition. We've done it 3 times now, so I think we just need to keep doing it. And I know I've certainly enjoyed it, and I hope you have too. I hope it's been not just been fun, but I hope it's been a blessing to you, and you've enjoyed getting into the Word and just participating. We sure appreciate how fully all of you have participated. So, it's been a good 9 weeks.
9 weeks.
So,
9 weeks. So the sanctuary will look a little different next week.
Right, we'll go back to our boring old
no, we won't.
plain old.
No, we won't.
But
It'll be all right.
So, only announcement I know of is that, I know of 2 actually. This Friday we're going into August, so it's our first Friday. So we'll have our worship team practicing here at the church Friday at 7 o'clock, and you're welcome to come and worship with us, and we hope you will. The other thing is next Sunday begins our You Asked For It sermon series, and many of you have made suggestions, and we appreciate those. Some are a little challenging, but we're going to choose some from the suggestions that you've made. If you still have a topic or a scripture or a question that you'd like to hear treated, and looked at in one of the sermons in August, let us know. You can drop a note in that giving box back there. If you want to write it on one of those envelopes that you put a little something in, that'd be all right too. So that's all I know of.
Okay. All right. Well, as always, we moved the food table, so we've got our little dance floor right there in the middle. So if, as we worship, please feel free to worship however you feel led. And if you want to clap your hands, clap. If you want to raise your hands, raise your hands. If you want to weep, weep. But feel free to move out into that space if you'd like to have a little bit more space, or if you'd like to stand. So.
And if you don't want to and do any of that,
that's perfectly fine as well. Yes. So let's worship this morning.
Oh,
neglected to open our service with prayer.
Oh.
I know, I didn't write it down on my notes.
You're
So
fired.
we're just gonna have to back up and just imagine that we're just starting. Rick, would you open with prayer for us?
Gracious Lord, we thank you for this tremendous atmosphere we can come together in Sam Beach. And it's great to be able to come together and just relax together in your house and just share together. Nice, even better when it's a food there. So it's great to be together. And I think that what the psalmist says, what joy he had when the people said, let's go to the house of the Lord. Yeah. And that's great that people want to come into your presence to praise you, worship you, time together, but most importantly to hear from you. And we pray that your Spirit will come upon us this morning. Whatever the worship we have will be worthy of you, but that the Spirit will come upon us and your voice will speak through the pastor, through everything that happens, and that we will go from here enriched and nourished spiritually. We thank you again for everything that happens here. We thank you for Stephen Tash that you've sent him here. We just pray that this church will grow and abound, and that the whole of the Lord will be able to come. We just ask this in your name.
Amen. Amen. Thank you.
My soul is down.
Psalm 40, 1 through 3. To the leader of David, a psalm. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the desolate pit, out of the miry bog, and set my feet on a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise for our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Waiting is tough, and being patient while you wait is even harder. We wait in queues, we wait for things to get better, we wait for test results. We had to wait 2 years before we could hug each other again. Last week we talked about how difficult situations sometimes have us waiting to hear God's voice or waiting to receive an answer to prayer. This psalm is a prayer of David, and it's really not so much a prayer as it's a report on a prayer. We do the same at our midweek prayer meeting, our midweek meetup, we call it. And somebody will ask for prayer, and we'll pray. And we may pray for several weeks, we may pray for several months, but eventually they'll share what we call a praise report. I love that, a praise report. And Psalm 40 is David's praise report. He waited patiently. God heard him. God lifted him up, set his feet on solid ground, and put a new song in his heart. And now he's telling everybody about it. We have a lot to be thankful for and to praise God for. And our praise is God's delight. He delights in the praise of his children, his beloved, his children he loves so much. Aren't we thankful this morning that God has put a new song in our hearts? Let's continue to praise him this morning.
How majestic is your name, oh Lord.
God.
We do serve a good God.
And it's good to sing about the goodness of God.
Amazing love that welcomes me, the kindness of mercy that bought with love wholeheartedly my soul undeserving. God, you're so good.
The song that we just heard a little excerpt of is a song called Help. It was the title track of a film by the same name, and it was recorded by a popular quartet from down in Liverpool called the Beatles. You might have heard of them. And in the summer of 1965, that song went to #1 on the charts in the UK and in the US. And a few years ago, it was ranked at number 29 among the 500 greatest songs of all time. And it's not surprising that it should have been so popular and has remained so. I think its popularity has something to do with the fact that it speaks to a common theme among all of humanity. We have all found ourselves in a place, in a situation, where we just have to cry out for help. A place where we have come to the end of our resources, and we are in distress, in dire straits, and all we can do is say, help. Now, when it was released 57 years ago, in 1965, Help became the 6th number one on the charts in a row by the Beatles. Beatlemania was in full swing at the time. I mean, they were on top of the world as far as popular music was concerned. They were selling out stadium concerts and touring the world. They were movie stars, and they were about to have their own animated TV show. You'd think that the Beatles had all they could ask for and more. But do you know that in 1980, the year that he was gunned down and killed, John Lennon said in an interview that the lyrics of that song weren't just written because that film needed some music. In fact, he said that they expressed his feelings because he was just overwhelmed with all the pressure and the stress and the attention that the meteoric rise of the Beatles had put on him. Help, the song, was not just a poetic, metaphorical expression. John Lennon said literally about what he was feeling in 1965. He said this, he said, "I was fat and depressed and I was crying out for help." You know, appearances can be deceiving. Even the most apparently successful and fortunate and rich and famous among us can find ourselves at the end of our road. And our culture, Western culture and British culture and certainly American culture, can make it hard to admit that we need some help, that we are in a situation that we would rather not be in, that we are finding it difficult to deal with the stress that we're experiencing in the particular place in which we find ourselves. Now, in general, we may feel a certain pressure that causes us to hesitate to admit when we need help. We may feel that we're valuable only when we are self-reliant and self-sufficient. In many ways, our culture has elevated the myth of the self-made man and the rugged individualist to such an iconic status that we have to launch public information campaigns to let people know that it's okay to ask for help. That there's no shame in saying, I can't do this on my own. I'm in a place where my resources have run out. My energy is exhausted. The stress and the pressure is too much and I cannot go on any further by myself. I'm in distress and I need some help. I need to be delivered. I need to be rescued. That goes against what many of us tend to think that society expects from us. We may be tempted to think of that as failure, as weakness. But in today's psalm, on this last Sunday of our Psalm Beach sermon series, we see that the psalmist in Psalm 107, that's the first psalm in the last section of Psalm, Book 5, the psalmist reminds us, and he also reminds the ancient Hebrew people, that the identity of the people of God is not characterized by rugged individualism. The hallmark of the people of God is not absolute self-sufficiency or total self-reliance. On the contrary, the people of God are the people who have cried out for help in the midst of their troubles. They are the people that God has delivered from their distress, the people that God has saved, that God has rescued from the hands of the adversary. In short, the people of God are the people who have been redeemed. And this morning I want us to look first at the scripture from the lectionary. Read that together. The lectionary gives us a portion of Psalm 107. I want to look at that for a moment, and then to consider together the entirety of the psalm. So you have in your bulletins there the shorter lectionary excerpt, and then you also have an insert, that front and back page that has the whole psalm written on it. And we're not going to read that all the way through because it's 43 verses long. But I do think that it's important that we consider this entire psalm and what's in it. And so we'll do that in just a little while. But first, let's look at the verses from the lectionary. They're verses 1 through 9, and then the last verse, verse 43. Now from Psalm 107, the psalmist writes, verse 1, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." His steadfast love endures forever. That is a refrain that we hear again and again throughout the Psalms. And you may remember that the Hebrew that is almost always translated as steadfast love is hesed. That everlasting faithfulness, God's unending loving kindness and mercy, his goodness that never fails. That quality of God that tells us that he is always working for the salvation of his people, that he is always making a way for those who are lost and oppressed, that he is continuously acting to deliver those who are in need of deliverance. God's hesed, his steadfast love, endures forever. And the psalmist continues in verse 2, "Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, those he redeemed from trouble." Now here in the NRSV, the translators use the word trouble there. But a literal translation of the Hebrew that's there would be those he redeemed from the hand of the adversary, from the hand of the enemy. The word hand is there and the word enemy is there. So the image is of one being gripped by the adversary, gripped by the enemy. And the word for enemy or adversary there is sar. Sar. And sar is an interesting word because it means enemy or adversary, but it also means tight or narrow. It describes a place where one feels confined, where there's not much room to maneuver. It refers to a tight spot. So we could translate the psalmist's words here that God has rescued them from a tight spot, from the squeeze of the grip of the hand of the adversary, from a place of pressure and stress. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, those he redeemed from trouble, and gathered from the lands, from the east and from the west and from the north and from the south, from all four directions, all over the world. Now it's hard not to think here of the way that in the book of Acts, in the New Testament, the good news of the gospel goes out from Jerusalem in all directions, into all the world. And here the psalmist refers to a time when all the people of God are gathered together from all four of those directions. And just as the psalmist has referred to four directions, north, east, south, and west, he's about to tell us about four groups of people that God has redeemed from four different situations. We hear about the first one here, beginning with verse 4. Some wandered in desert ways, finding no way to an inhabited town. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted within them. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. Now you'll see that this verse is in bold type in your sermon notes, and that's because I want you to pay attention to this verse, because you'll see it again. It is a recurring refrain that appears in each section, each of these four sections of this psalm. And in this recurring refrain, we find that word for trouble that we just mentioned, the Hebrew word sar. Again, the one we saw in verse 3, the one that implies a tight spot, a place of pressure and stress, the squeeze of the hand of the enemy. And so the psalmist says that in the midst of this tight spot, in the midst of pressure and constriction, where it's hard to move, From that place, the people cried out, and God delivered them from their distress. Now, the word that's translated distress there is not sar, but is a different word that's used to describe an undesirable situation that the people are in. And the Hebrew there is metsuka. Metsuka sounds like something you might get at a Mexican restaurant, but metsuka. And the root word of metsuka is that word you see there, that little four-letter word, suk, T-S-U-Q, suk. And that word suk means to constrain, to tighten, to exert pressure upon, to stress out, to squeeze. So both sar and suk, the words here for trouble and distress, have to do with tightness and narrowness, being in a tight spot, being under pressure, feeling the squeeze and the stress that makes it hard to move and hard to breathe, that constricts and constrains. Maybe you've been in a place or a situation that made you feel like that. Sar and suk. These are in our phrase book for today. They cried to the Lord in their trouble, and He delivered them from their distress. Verse 7, He led them by a straight way until they reached an inhabited town. Let them thank the Lord for His steadfast love, for His wonderful works to humankind. Now, this verse is also in bold type in your printouts. Remember it, because we'll see it again. And here again, we see the psalmist refer to God's steadfast love, His hesed. Let them thank the Lord for His steadfast love, for His wonderful works to humankind, for He satisfies the thirsty, and the hungry He fills with good things. And now to verse 43, the last verse of the psalm. Let those who are wise give heed to these things, and consider the steadfast love, the hesed of the Lord. May God bless the reading of the Scriptures this morning. Now the psalmist in Psalm 107 tells us of a gathering of the people of God, the people who have been redeemed, who have been rescued, who've been delivered, and who've been gathered together by God from the east, the west, the north, and the south, from the four cardinal directions. And corresponding to these four directions are four groups of people. Some of the people of God, we heard in the reading just now, that some wandered in the desert, in desert waste, finding no way to an inhabited town. But that's only the first of the four groups that we hear about in Psalm 107. The first of four groups of people who find themselves in trouble, in distress, in a tight spot, where they're feeling the grip, the squeeze of the enemy's grip. And I just want to briefly take a minute to look at these four groups of people this morning, in these four directions of distress. And we can remember these four directions of distress because, like directions and distress, they all begin with the letter D. And so we're going to see that the psalmist tells us in Psalm 107 about the desert, and about detention, and about disease, and finally about disaster. And when we think of the people of God as those who have been redeemed, these four situations, I want to suggest that these four situations answer the question, redeemed from what? Four places, four situations. These are four situations from which the people of God have been redeemed. But before we look closely at these four, I want to suggest something. And what I want to suggest is that while we might approach this ancient text, this psalm that was written eons ago, in a historical context that is vastly different from our own, I want to suggest that it is entirely possible that we might look at this text and think, we might assume that there would be no possible way that we might find any commonality, any connection, any way of relating to the experience of this psalmist or to his audience. That the situations from which these people of God have been redeemed, these directions of distress, might mean very little to anyone reading this psalm in 2022. But what I want to suggest is that while we, in our contemporary setting, in our modern experience, might not have ever found ourselves lost in the desert or locked up in jail, while we might not have ever been stricken with a disease that finds us at the very threshold of death's door or in danger of losing our lives in a tempest-tossed ship at sea, even though we might not have experienced those specific situations, we can still, even in the 21st century, identify with the distress and the trouble, the suk and the tsar that the psalmist is describing here. So let's look at the first situation. The first direction of distress from which the people of God have been delivered, the desert. The psalmist tells us in verse 4, some wandered in desert wastes, finding no way to an inhabited town. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted within them. Now maybe you have never been truly lost out in a literal desert, out in the middle of a barren, sand-swept land without water or nourishment, wandering hopelessly without direction underneath the hot sun. But I have a feeling that most of us, if not all of us, have felt alone at one time or another, abandoned and without support, in need of companionship and the provision of our brothers and sisters, in need of community. And that's what verses 4 to 7 are about. The desert is about loneliness. It's about being disconnected, about those who wandered alone in need of the assistance of a family, of a village, in need of the corporate relationship that we were created for. We may every once in a while need some solitude. We may every once in a while find ourselves in a situation where we have to be independent, where we have to fend for ourselves, alone in the wilderness, but we can't survive for long in such a situation. We need each other. We were designed, we were created to live in community, to take care of each other. And when we find ourselves alone, we get hungry and thirsty and our soul faints within us. We need to find our way back to the place where our people dwell. And so we're told that they cry out for God. And God delivers them by making a straight path, leading them by a straight way. Their wanderings are through. Their far-off countries wanderings are all done. They head straight to an inhabited town. God delivers them by bringing them into the presence of others, into community. Because when we get right down to it, the truth is that we need each other. How many of us can say that we were saved from our distress by being brought into a community, into a fellowship with others? Where would we be without our brothers and sisters? Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. God redeems his people from the desert, from isolation, from loneliness, from abandonment. Now the second example, the second situation, the second direction of distress that the psalmist tells us about is detention. In verse 10, the psalmist tells us that some sat in darkness and in gloom, prisoners in misery and in irons. In the first example, the psalmist tells us about those who are in the desert, who are outside and wandering. But now we hear about those who are inside and unable to go anywhere. Those who are prisoners in darkness and chains, those who are immobile. Now, I don't know if you've ever been inside a prison. Maybe you have as a visitor or as an inmate. I don't know. But I can remember back when I was doing my medical residency, after med school, I did a psychiatric rotation at a maximum security prison outside of Charleston, South Carolina. It was called the Kirkland Correctional Institute. And now I want to tell you, that place was just about as maximum security as you can imagine. There were armed guards and barbed wire and high walls and patrol gates that you had to go through to get in or out. But part of that facility was the state of South Carolina's death row, where offenders who had been condemned, sentenced to be executed, were housed. And every once in a while, I'd have to visit a prisoner on death row. I'd have to show my identification, and the guard would let me into that area. And every time I passed through those thick iron gates into that area where those cells were, I'd hear the electronic locks clamp shut behind me, and they would just echo with a deafening finality and impermeability about them. And I'd look around at those thick steel doors and those impenetrable cinder block walls, and I will never forget the feeling of absolute helplessness that I would feel, because I knew without any doubt whatsoever that I was in a place from which there was no possibility of escape. I was in a place where unless that guard opened the gate and let me out, there was no exit. I had relinquished control. And it was then that I began to feel a little bit of what those prisoners who lived in that place must have felt every minute of every day. They were stuck. They were captives. They weren't going anywhere. But the psalmist tells us in verse 13, that refrain that we heard back in verse 6, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. And he goes on to say, he brought them out of darkness and gloom and broke their bonds asunder. And here's that second recurring refrain. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind, for he shatters the doors of bronze and cuts into the bars of iron. Maybe you've never been inside a literal prison, but every one of us at one time or another will find ourselves in a place where we feel like we are held captive, where we have no control, where we are trapped in darkness and gloom, and we know that in and of ourselves there is no escape from our situation, where there is no other option than to cry out to the Lord in our distress, in our bondage, and he'll bring us out from darkness and gloom and break our bonds asunder. Now, freedom may not look like what we imagined, but we will be truly free. People of God have been redeemed from the desert and redeemed from detention. And now the third direction of distress. We see it in verse 17, and it is disease. Some were sick through their sinful ways, and because of their iniquities endured affliction. They loathed any kind of food, and they drew near to the gates of death. Now, I probably don't need to tell you that nothing will make you feel more helpless than sickness, than illness. There is nothing like a medical crisis to remind you that you are not in control. And maybe you've never been in that situation, but one day it is more than likely that you will be. There's a very good chance that every one of us is going to be in that situation, because you will find that it doesn't matter what you want to do, what you have planned to do, what you need to do. When illness comes to call, no matter how urgent, how important our plans are, the forces of disease will take priority. Over these last 2 years, we've seen how nothing more than a mere virus called SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19 has brought the whole world to a standstill in ways that we never imagined possible. It is an inconvenient and uncomfortable truth that a microscopic microbe, or a minuscule blood clot, or an invisible and unknown aneurysm in the wall of one of our arteries, or any other number of other causes can render us utterly helpless. And the fact is, it doesn't matter how urgent those things on our agenda and our calendar, on our schedule may be, if we happen to find ourselves lying intubated and wired up to a bunch of machines in an intensive care unit, when we find ourselves at the very gates of death, it's going to become painfully and blatantly obvious that we are not in charge. That there's nothing left to do but to cry out to God for help. And that's what the psalmist tells us, repeating that refrain. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out from their distress. Now, I want to point out one thing about this illness passage. These verses here around verse 17. They are not just about illness that just happens, that blindsides us, that comes out of nowhere. These verses are also about the guilt that comes from self-inflicted injury. Verse 17 tells us some were sick through their sinful ways, and because of their iniquities endured affliction. Now, on the one hand, these words reflect the idea from the wisdom tradition that if you do bad things are going to happen to you. And that kind of thinking tends to forget that sometimes bad things happen to people who didn't do anything bad to deserve them. But on the other hand, sometimes the things that we do, our behaviors, are directly responsible for our becoming unwell, for our sickness, for our morbidity. And if we look at the Hebrew word there that is translated as sick, it is evil. Yeah, it looks just like an English word evil, but it's not. It's different. It doesn't just mean to be ill, to be unwell, to be sick. It also means to be foolish. Foolish. And I think we can find a reminder here that an awful lot of what makes us unwell in our society today, the diseases that cause so much morbidity and mortality, are self-inflicted, a result of our foolishness. You know, diet-related illnesses are what kill most people in our culture, and that is completely dependent on the way that we behave. We bring it upon ourselves. We shorten our lives and we make ourselves less capable of living up to the call that God's placed on our lives simply because of the choices we make, or because we don't think about the choices that we make. But it's not just diet. It's also the substances that we consume. It's also the way we exploit our planet. So much of our unwellness we have brought upon ourselves. We humans have been foolish. But if we'll cry out to the Lord in our trouble, He will save us from our distress, one way or another, according to God's will. He will save us from our distress. So the psalmist has moved us through the desert and tension and disease, and finally we come to this fourth example that the psalmist gives us of the way that God has redeemed His people, delivering them from distress. Beginning with verse 23. And this is a description of a disaster. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the mighty waters. And then the psalmist tells us that the storms come, that the winds blow and the waves tossed up to the heavens and down to the depths, and they're terrified. You know, Pastor Tasha and I went on a cruise some years ago. We were talking about it just this morning with our family, and some of our family members were worried about getting seasick. Mm-hmm. But people who had been on cruises before, they assured us, they said, oh, those cruise ships are so enormous. They're like floating cities. You don't even know you're moving at all. But do you know when we left out of Florida, Miami I think it was, we were the last ship to leave before they canceled all the subsequent departures. Because there was a storm off the coast. I believe it was a hurricane and we were headed right into it. But we remembered what we'd been told, how the ship was so big we wouldn't notice anything. And you know what? That turned out to be incorrect. When we got into that storm, I remember we looked out the windows of our stateroom and the waves weren't below us. They weren't even straight out from us. They were up above us like skyscrapers. And that ship reeled and rocked, and furniture slid across the floor, and things that were on tables wouldn't stay there. When you walked down the hall, you had to hold on to the handrail or you'd fall over. As the psalmist says in verse 27, you'd reel and stagger like drunkards. As the psalmist tells us, he knows what that's like. And if you think it was disconcerting and scary on that cruise ship, just imagine how folks a couple thousand years ago must have felt in the dark on stormy seas when disaster comes and dark clouds fill the night sky and obscure the stars that might guide them to a safe harbor. Imagine how the disciples felt in their boat in the storm in Mark 4. It's not surprising that Mark uses the language and imagery that reminds us of Psalm 107 when he talks about Jesus in that boat in that storm. Because the point is that Jesus is the same God whose steadfast love endures forever. And when the disciples cried out for help, just like these folks here in the psalm, they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out from their distress. There's that recurring refrain, he made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad, because it had become quiet. And he brought them to their desired haven. And here's the other repeating verse, let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. Now maybe you've never been in a storm at sea with only a ship between you and a watery grave. When the winds blow and the waves toss you around and you lose your bearings. When all you want to do is to be able to make it to a safe haven. But I want you to notice a key detail that the psalmist gives us about this group of people who went down to the sea in ships. Verse 23 tells us that they were doing business on the mighty waves, doing business. The Hebrew there is melakah, and it refers to a person's work, to a person's occupation, to a person's job. The job that they do. And so the psalmist isn't just telling us about a storm at sea. They're telling us about a stressful workplace, about folks trying to do their job in the midst of a crisis. And many of us may not know what it is to be in a ship in stormy seas. We may not have ever been on a ship at all, but we may have found ourselves in the midst of a storm at our workplace. Maybe we're just trying to do our jobs and feed our families, and trouble comes and we find ourselves in distress, tossed about and fearful, concerned for the future, trying to keep our head above water when it looks like it's going to be sink or swim. That's when we can cry out to the one whose steadfast love endures forever, to the one who calms the wind and the waves. We can cry out to the Lord in our trouble, and he'll bring us out of our distress. Whether we're in the desert of loneliness, whether we're locked up, detained in a situation from which it seems there is no escape, whether we're in need of healing from ill health or struggling through the stormy seas. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you have cried out for help. Maybe you've seen the redemption through the Lord's steadfast love. Well, the psalmist tells us, let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Let the redeemed gather from all four corners of the earth and say so. Let them extol him in the congregation. Let them praise him in the assembly. Let them tell of his deeds with joy. Let them offer thanksgiving offerings. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. He turns deserts into pools of water. He raises the needy out of distress. He calms the storm. He brings healing and breaks through prison bars. I'd like Pastor Tasha and our worship team to come up. If they would, let the redeemed say so. I was lost, but now I'm found. His steadfast love endures forever. And I don't know of a better way to end this Psalm Beach series than singing about God's hesed, about God's steadfast love, about God's goodness. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. His steadfast love endures forever. Let the redeemed say, all my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I'm able, I'll sing of the goodness of God. Let's sing together.
I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hand. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I
more than you could possibly imagine.